now listening to Soundspace, the podcast where we explore the space of sound.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to Soundspace. We're really excited about today's guest. He is an absolute icon and certainly an inspiration to the sound community. Please welcome Kevin Austin.
Hello, Kevin, and welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Glad to be here.
Glad to have you.
Very glad to have you around. Yeah, and Anthony, how are you feeling?
I'm so good. I'm really happy. It's been a great week, and really happy to be talking to you, Kevin, and you too, Jaian, of course.
Yeah, of course. It's every episode, you know.
Yeah.
Kevin,
How often do you do these?
We do these once a month.
You do them once a month. Do you have fun doing them?
Yes.
What is your background in sound?
Yeah.
Hey, wait a minute. Wait.
Well, is this program? Not sure if you heard of it, Electroacoustic.
Kevin, I'm beyond excited to begin this conversation with you. Anthony and I obviously had you at Concordia, and you've taught us so much about the world of sound.
Where's Concordia University? Come on, guys, precision.
In Montreal, Quebec.
Now, the reason for that is that, see, I've been doing this a long time, and I've posters that have a date on them, and I have no idea what year they were. But so what you have to do is when you begin giving factual information like this, you have to assume that someone 15 years from now is going to be listening to this.
I agree. There's definitely a time capsule element to these podcasts. I want to know, Kevin, why did you say yes to this? What do you want to share with us about how you feel right now in this moment?
I want to be recognized as a universal messiah.
Of course.
Of course. I mean, what else is there in life?
Wouldn't.
I could be being a cosmic messiah, but maybe I'll save that for a later life. No, okay. So I'll actually answer that question as if it was straight. You invited me,
and we're so glad that you said yes to this. Obviously,
why wouldn't I say yes?
You're a busy man.
Exactly. You were just telling us 38 evaluations. You know, the electroacoustic program is as busy as it's ever been. I see it on social media a lot, and I think that you are the heart of that program, and it's so great to be able to discuss all these elements with you. Let's just start with something introductory, and then we'll just go wherever the podcast takes us. Why did you decide to go into sound and go into audio? Just a wide open question for you.
Well, why did you decide to have hair on your head?
I decided to have hair on my head by birth.
Well, that's how I was born.
Right. You were born for sound. Okay.
A very different kind. I was a weird kid. One of the weird things about me was that I was born, I had really good pitch and really good rhythm, really fine discrimination in terms of sound. Just, I did nothing to have these skills. I didn't train them. I learned how to train them later, but they were identified by the time I was 5 or 6. I was invited to sing a farewell song to the minister at the church, and I was maybe 6 at the time. And somebody identified this with the story of my life. Someone identified me as having something special or some particular kind of skill, and they asked me to sing the song, and they taught me the song probably in a matter of 1 or 2 listenings, and then I sang it along with the piano. And then the next Sunday I went up, and the organist played in the tiniest little organ sound they could make, and I sang it. I was maybe 6 at the time. So people recognized I had very specific skill sets that were just unusual, being like that all the way along.
Very interesting. And how does that take you into electroacoustics? Because that is definitely a domain that you find yourself in your daily life.
Everyone finds themselves in that domain. I want to define electroacoustics, since you use this term here, as being electrical energy transduced to acoustical energy. Anything that comes through a loudspeaker is electroacoustic. In which case, 8% of most people's lives, in terms of flow of information, except speaking directly to somebody else, is electroacoustic in nature. And there's a number of things about the medium, which I'll come back to in a little while, but that wasn't your question immediately. Also, if you think about traditional music, and it doesn't matter which culture or which century it is, it's a very restricted kind of language design. Every culture that has music has, more or less roughly speaking, something called notes of some kind or other, whether it's North Korean or whether it's South Asian or West African or whatever. Many cultures have a thing called a beat of some kind, or some kind of structure underlying the division of the time. So if one accepts that these are norms, there are people whose lives live outside of the restrictions of notes and metric time divided evenly. And the simple example of this is indigenous cultures around the world, where they listen to the sounds they have to reference are the sounds of the wind. If they live near water, the sounds of water. They have rain, sounds of rain. And none of these things fit into the pitch or the metered time domain. They live outside of this. And they used to be, in the West, they were called sound effects or something or other. But there are a growing number of people who approach sound in a more abstract fashion than was in 19th century Europe or had been in other cultures the previous 2,000 to 3,000 years. And the way Western Europeans in the early 20th century left representational art visually, they began to leave representational sound in the same way they began to leave the idea of the note and the metric beat being the core or the center. And historically, what's interesting about this in terms of the development of Western music can be traced through the technology of Western music, because it's one of the few cultures, the Western European culture is one of the few cultures that had an extensive technological base for the music. Let me define technological for you so you don't get completely freaked out by this. I'm not talking about hollowing out a bone and drilling holes into it to make a flute as being. It's true that is a technology, but the big change in the Western musical history was just over 1,000 years ago, when Guido d'Arezzo named the notes. And what he did in doing this was an interesting structural change in European culture from other cultures, because it meant that, unlike books which had existed in many cultures, and like the Greeks and the Romans and the Chinese and the South Indians and Asians had this. And the thing about a book that separates it as a technology is it allows an idea to be placed into a form that will last longer than the life of the person who wrote it. The knowledge wouldn't die with them.
No, it wouldn't.
Pardon?
It wouldn't. I'm agreeing with you.
Yep. It wouldn't die with them, and it didn't need the person to be there to transmit it to other people, and it could be duplicated. These are all characteristics of what would be subsequently, as other times called, literate civilizations, where instead of the civilization requiring person to person and individual to individual transmission, even through mythologies, the invention, in the Sumerian invention of little lines on clay tablets, and which the Egyptians eventually picked up maybe 1,000 years later, it meant that information could be stored some form that would be available to people who had never met, and in places they couldn't get to, and across time. If these are the ideas which lie behind this is fine. People were able to draw pictures, and we have cave drawings of bison, and we have little scratches next to them that mark off when their fertile period is and when they will be back in the area so they can be killed, and that's what they've been decoding in the cave drawings. But no one alive today has ever heard Beethoven speak. No one alive today can tell you what accent he had or what accent Bach had. And Johannes Brahms, who died in 1893, recorded 5 words on the Edison cylinder. And it is, Ich bin, or I am Dr. Johannes Brahms. That's all he said. So we have one sonic engraving of Johannes Brahms' voice. And we're so accustomed as a culture and society and as a world to be able to have access to the sound aspect of people and their lives and living, that it's forgotten that 150 years ago, there was no possibility of this. In 1870, there was nothing. There were beginnings of being able to see the squiggles of a stylus on smoked glass, but there was no way of decoding that because the information only went one way in the system. What began to happen in the late 1800s, late 19th century in Europe, along with all the other changes which were taking place in Europe, was a major philosophical shift that occurred when it became of real interest to be able to transmit the sound of something from one place to another place. And this started by coding, by using Morse code, effectively. And Morse code allowed for the transmission of information at the speed of light over distances which were exceeded visual sight and could be used at night, because night was a block to this kind of thing. So the late 19th century in Europe, Germany particularly, and Great Britain, as major centers of this particular form, began to break down those final barriers that existed in the European concept between people and having instantaneous communication. And if you think about the ideas that you are promoting in doing a podcast, you are storing not simply the text I'm speaking at this point in time, but if you listen carefully to how I speak, you'll find that I use cadence, rhythm, timing, structure, and all kinds of metric and rhythmic structures and intonation patterns to convey other information about how I feel about these things without them being written down as text, where you wouldn't get that at all. If you ever thought about, you were in classes, which I was in as well at the same time as you. People in the classes think that I'm teaching them. I have news for you. They're teaching me. I learned things every time I have contact with people in the classes. I learn stuff. But if you read a transcript of the classes, they don't have this other thing in them. Mm-hmm. They don't have this other timing thing. I've noticed that I can engage people in a whole other level of conversation simply by changing how I speak and how I use timing in what I say.
What do you mean by that? I mean, I understand what you mean, just like maybe if you can give a little example.
I go to lots of meetings, and there are people who they speak at the meetings and they read the notes from the meetings, and it's blah, 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 and it's just talking heads, and it's so much stuff. When many years ago, I learned what I needed to do when I spoke to people is I needed, as you can see, because we're on Zoom, you can see my hands. You can see that I'm speaking to you with my hands on a continuous basis, and my hands are reflecting the energy flow which is coming out. But the simple text doesn't do that. And I learned those kinds of things as a very young child because I didn't have good communication skills. I still don't have good communication skills. What I've done is I've developed the ability to mimic what I think people want my communication skills to be, to make sense of what it is I'm saying. And that includes leaving enough gaps after my sentences. As you know, this sentence hasn't ended yet. It's already 35 seconds long. It's like Marcel Proust writing 700-word sentences. The listener is brought into this flow by the manipulation of your mind wanting to listen to what I'm going to say at the end of the sentence, that wasn't the end of the sentence either, of course, because I began somewhat else. And so I had to learn these things to survive socially and societally. And it took me about 25 years to do this. So I was in my mid-20s by the time I began to develop techniques that I could rely upon to an extent make people comfortable on a more regular basis. By the time I was 26, I'd been teaching in the university for 5 years. I began teaching the classes I taught as an example of this, going back to electroacoustics. I taught a course called Contemporary Idioms and Media. We call it Contemporary Idiots and Media at the time. Yeah, you go back 50 years. It's 2023 is January the 15th, 2023. That's, as you said before, during the intro. We met with Kevin Austin on Zoom, but you had to explain it to people. But if we were doing a video, you would have put that into the title with the introductory elements of that. As you learned from two of the assignments you did in 205 and 305, I wanted videos of the shows, and I insisted people put titles, information, and credits at the end. And many people didn't want to do that. They thought their performance was the show. And I was saying, no. This is time capsule stuff.
Metadata. Yeah.
Thank you. And metadata is interesting because metadata, as you know, is the reduction into categories. Mm-hmm. That's very subtle. That's a very subtle thing that comes out of information theory and communication theory, which was basically the end of the 1940s. At the end of the 1940s, another change occurred, which was the introduction of the magnetic tape recorder, which had been developed in Germany. By the mid-1930s, they had one. And they were very useful instruments, but they were thought of as being ways of holding on to information and communicating information outside of real time, because it allowed for editing and it allowed for sound to be manipulated the way we do with text processors now. And so sound became a concrete medium where this piece of tape, which was 10 centimeters to 20 centimeters long, had magnetism on it that could be listened to. But while it came into the audio world in the late 1940s, it had been in film since the late 1920s. And it had been on bits of plastic before, or Bakelite actually, before that, starting in the 1890s. But they couldn't be, the Bakelite, the discs couldn't be edited. All they had available to edit them was to have two players and to record onto a third player, and the degradation of signal was much too, it couldn't be real. But film people had already got to this point by 1933. And the music world, a very traditional conservative area of art, was reluctant to consider this technology. The first stereo recordings, you both did recording courses, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I didn't do any in Concordia, but I did some in college, and yeah.
And did they tell you when the first stereo recordings were made?
I believe so.
What year? Do you remember?
No. This was 10 years ago that I did these courses, so I'll be honest, I don't remember.
I don't remember either.
Yeah.
Go ahead, call me out on my own show.
I don't learn information that way. I don't know information until I know it.
Absolutely.
I have it. I don't forget it. So in 1933, you say 1933?
Yes, you did.
They didn't have tape recorders then. They had optical recorders for film, but they didn't have tape recorders. In 1933, the Philadelphia Orchestra, under Leopold Stokowski, someone came to him with a bright idea. And they said, we want to record the orchestra with two microphones, unheard of, impossible. One here, and we're going to record this onto two disc cutters. So what we have is two turntables with 78 RPM disc cutters, and we're going to put the microphones up here, and we're going to record the orchestra, a left channel and a right channel.
And they invented stereo.
And the idea, a lot of the theory behind this has remained unchallenged by the recording industry. It would be different if it had been done differently. It would be a different world if instead of doing that, they had decided to record in three channels with a left, a right, and a center, because the film industry was going there, because they put the voice in the middle and they put all the sound on the sides. The period of time, starting in the late 19th century, there was a growth towards accessing sound as sound without having to be voice, spoken voice, sung voice, or music. And there was another area called, as you know, Foley or sound effects. That still exists in the industry, and it's still held to by many people in media industry. So I got an email the other day from someone who's looking for, what this person wants to do is they want to compose music for computer video games. And I thought that was interesting because the person didn't say sound design, which was a term which is now almost 50 years old.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't say that. They said they wanted to compose the music. And I've dealt with people in film and animation who want composers to compose the music, and they want the electroacoustics people to do the Foley. And I try to explain to them that the people I've met in Concordia Electroacoustics department, or the electroacoustics area in that department, about 40% of them have the skills to do the music at the level that anybody else in the department can compose. And some of them are better at it because, for example, we have a number of students who you have met in your time at Concordia who came to Concordia. They had already received either college diplomas, 3-year college diplomas, or a number of them had finished their Bachelor of Music degree somewhere. And they decided they want to expand the range of sounds that they had when they used traditional instruments, because there are many paths to getting sound coming through loudspeakers. And one is that the traditionally trained musician says, I want more. I just want more of whatever that is. Where am I going to find a way of taking the sound of my flute and giving it an echo or giving it a reverb or making it into a canon, or my violin, like Laurie Anderson playing her electric violin with a delay pedal? And when the classically trained composer of the 60s, 70s, and 80s wanted to do that, there was nowhere to do it because it was not accepted, widely accepted in the classical forms. But if in 1975 I said to you, I want to put an echo on this, what you would have done had you been alive at that time, because you weren't alive at that time.
Not yet, no.
But if I said to you today, I want to put an echo in this, what would you do in terms of hardware?
I mean, I'm all in the box, so I don't know if there's a... I mean, you could...
You buy a guitar pedal.
You can buy a guitar pedal. Yeah, true.
Do some tape
You
delay.
can get Guitar Rig
Classical
5. No, I'm kidding.
Hardware box. You just buy the box, you please stick your guitar in it, you take it out, and you plug it in your amplifier, and you got echo and reverb. But to do this from an academic standpoint point of view is the culture was it is the culture. The classical culture is very backward looking. You study music which is 200, 300, 400, 700, 800, 900 years old. I regularly listen to music which is over 1,000 years old, and I don't feel it's anything less than contemporary, because that's the way I structure time. That I don't think that Guillaume de Machaut of 700-800 years ago is any less contemporary than Frank Zappa or whoever it is today. Justin Beaver Lake. No, Beaver Lake is the lake on the top of Mount Royal. So it must be Justin Lake. No, he didn't. No, Justin Beaver. That's it. That's what it is. I'm not up to date on contemporary culture. I don't have the time for contemporary culture. But so you can see that there are many streams. I've mentioned very briefly film. I mentioned very briefly the recording industry with Stokowski recording the Dvorak New World Symphony with 2 lathe cutters in 1933. RCA did the same thing with him as the first commercial stereo recordings in the early 50s, and they released them as 45 RPM discs with the stereo head, but no one could play them because no one had invented the stereo phono cartridge yet to do this. But there were scientists and there were artists and there were all kinds of people who wanted to do this. The underlying feature here was that they wanted to be able to convey the sound effect, the emotional content, the gesture, the energy of the events which they experience. They wanted to be able to store them, have them physically available, and really important, to be able to distribute them, because the distribution wasn't really possible until Petrucci invented musical movable type. So the printing press could then go and he would have a little quarter note thingy on the 3rd line and one on the 4th line and one on the 3rd space, and the printer would put together, just like putting together the letters in movable type for text, they would be able to put together the symbols And if you look at old manuscripts of 1500, they were done with movable musical type. What you find is that it meant that once that type had been set into that place, the printer could make 100 copies or 200 copies. And therefore, that piece, or whatever the idea is, that musical idea, could be distributed without having to have 100 monks sit and copy the score for 6 weeks, and then have another 100 monks take them somewhere. They could just wrap them in the paper, put them on the stagecoach, and send them off to Antwerp, or to London, or to Paris, or to Barcelona, or whatever. So the distribution network of this, which was available in Western Europe. This is, again, a thing about this, about Western Europe and China. But in China, the distribution network was limited. It was very restricted to the emperor and the ruling classes. But that wasn't the case in Europe. So Europe developed all of these kinds of ideas through society, which underpin the changes which took place in the Western European culture in this way. This is the world I was born into. I was born in 1948, which is the year before the transistor was finally formalized. It had been kind of on the edge, but the transistor changed everything because transistor is just a switch. That's all it does, basically. It's not quite that simple, but it's okay. And information theory proposed that you have a source, and you have a communications channel, and you have a receiver. And this is not new to you. This is the world you live in. But in 1945, this idea as being how information and communication work was very strange, because they were still thinking in 19th century terms of having to have some kind of physical channel and gatekeepers on information. The gatekeepers of the 19th century in music were the publishers, because there would be 100 composers and they would publish 10 of them. So the other 90 got left out. And you can see where I'm going with this, because while it's a history lesson, it's also an answer to your question about electroacoustics. Because in the 19th century, if you weren't picked up as a publishable composer, the score you wrote, the individual right, would just sit in a closet somewhere. And the last 20 years has seen lots of closets being opened in more ways than just the simple one of sex and gender. But there were physically closets being opened, and people would discover piles of written music. And they existed in 1 or 2 copies. Now, you've heard of a piece called The Four Seasons. The Four Seasons is a piece by the Italian composer Antonio Vivaldi, who lived in Venice, and he worked in a girls' orphanage. And he wrote lots of music, but he was discovered by after he died in the mid-1700s. He was forgotten. And all his scores went into the monasteries and the convents and all this stuff would disappear. And in the early 1920s, a musicologist remembered this strange, now Vivaldi, yes, he was a composer sometime back then, and he went looking for these scores. And suddenly, over a period of a decade or so, he found many, many hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these pieces. Vivaldi is now a common name because the music has appeal to it, and it's very accessible. But for a period of almost 200 years, he didn't exist. And not like Bach. Bach disappeared in 1750-ish to be rediscovered 80 years later. There's another stream to this coming. I'm just giving you a warning that this actually does go to someone. So there were gatekeepers on whether or not the piece or the composer rose in the system hierarchically to be able to be accepted by a publisher for publication. Meant the publisher would effectively pay, or pay for the engraving of the score and then the printing of 300 copies, and they would send 4 to London and 3 to Paris and 1 to Manchester and 1 to little cities throughout the German states. And the composer would have their pieces, therefore, in these cities But to convert them from symbol to sound required to hire 2 or 20 or 60 musicians who would devote anywhere between 2 hours and 6 weeks of time to learn to play this piece. And therefore, the piece had a particular kind of commercial aspect to it, that because so many resources had been put into the building of the piece historically, it was an expensive item. It was worth much more than simply the sheets of paper it was written on, because there were so many people involved in bringing it to the top of the pile. I'm going to jump forward 150 years, from 1850 to the year 2000. In the year 2000, just before the iPhone, the distribution of the piece that you, Anthony, or you, Jaian, composed was not restricted by whether or not a publisher was going to pick you up. Because all you would do is you would take the file in 1980, before you were born, and copy it onto a cassette, and then make 20 copies of the cassette and send them to your friends. And they could make copies, and they could make copies. And the cost of that was $1.95 for the cassette. So you could have you can, as a composer, as a performer, as an artist, or whatever is going to be the name in the society, you had access to a distribution network. The distribution network wasn't controlled by the gatekeepers, because it was a public service of the post office to just send that stuff out. And you weren't restricted by having to go into a $185,000 studio to record what you were doing, because in the early 1970s, the first multi-track cassette machines came out, and people could simply record themselves and do something which was unheard of 50 years previously. It was not unheard of, it wasn't done, which was to overdub. And today it's just, in the work you do, in the work you've done, in your study of this field, you could, for example, take 3 independent recordings. Let's say, just as a completely fictional case, let's just say it's a Sunday evening and 3 guys are sitting around in front of their computers talking to each other.
For example,
yeah, John, this is completely hypothetical.
Totally hypothetical.
This would never happen.
Not currently happening on this very podcast. Just want to make that clear.
That's right. And you could take my voice and you can make a loop, make a loop, make a loop, make a loop. Stop.
Make a loop, 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 make a loop.
And therefore you have access not only to the sound as a documentary form, you have access to the sound as a creative form. That's the change that began to happen in the late 1940s, late 1940s. In the middle 40s, Norman McLaren from the National Film Board, an animator, began to draw wave shapes on plastic along with many other people, take pictures of them, and then convert those wave shapes into loops on 35 millimeter film, and then play them back. And he had invented a synthesizer by drawing the wave shape and making it into a loop. He could speed it up and slow it down, in which case he moves the pitch of it up and down like a mellotron. He would physically draw the wave shape in this. And the number of people invented versions of this between the late 1930s and by the late 1960s, it was common because other things were happening. But people were interested, scientific and artistic people were interested in drawing together their knowledge and experience of the science of these things. And with this knowledge and experience, exploring creativity, exploring the imagination, exploring the other ways without having to work within the limits. So you get to 2005, and while it had been possible up until that time, basically, for almost anyone to record if they had a cassette recorder and a microphone, in 2005, with the development of the iPhone, the whole world changed again, because everyone who had a smartphone could get an app, or what was then called a program, that would be a recorder. And anyone who wanted to and was of the nature had, for whatever, how many hundreds of dollars it was, they had the recorder. And you guys were born in the mid-1990s?
Yeah.
Well, about. So you were born at a time when the first DAWs, digital audio workstations, were kind of getting established. The whole DAW situation has matured. It's actually become a very static field of development, because it's still stuck in certain 19th century understandings of what people would do if they recorded sound, because it serves the recording industry. But you were born at the time when the idea of having multiple tracks of information available as a composer was just reaching the point where you didn't have to go out and spend $85,000 on a 24-channel open reel tape recorder. You could go in, you can buy the Apple IIe, and you could put an 8-track recorder on that, on the Apple IIe. At that time, when I bought my Apple IIe, it cost me $2,400, and it had 64K of memory. That's a big memory, and I paid another $400 for a card that would allow the extension of that to 128K. I could never get the card to work because it is a special switching device to be able to move it, because it were 8-bit. Everything was 8-bit address. But I had first started using computers in 1969. This is 55 years ago. I went to the National Research Council in Ottawa while I was doing a course at McGill called Computers and Music. It was one of those courses which was tremendously popular. I mean, really popular. Popular like you don't see these days. There were 3 of us in the class. No, I lie. There were 4 of us. There was a teacher.
Oh, good. Yeah.
Paul Peterson, myself, Denis Laurent, and I can't remember who the third one was, because I think he dropped out after 2 weeks. Denis Laurent came in one day and said, I want to do a presentation on information theory. And I thought, I was very young. I was only 20, 21. And I thought, what is this, the information theory? Why do I need to know all this science stuff? I mean, it's going to just interfere with my creativity. And he said, I'm going to use the word in a way that is not used in the vernacular and in society. And I thought, the last person who said that to me, who I heard say that to me, was someone who was going to tell me something about a particular compositional technique. And when they finished explaining it, I went home and spent about 6 weeks trying to make sense of what I'd heard, and went, oh, yes, of course. I just have to change or modify the meanings of the words to fit into how I understand this. And as long as I don't get tied up on the words, I'll be fine. And so he talks about information being measured in a unit, which I didn't understand a little bit, called a bit. Now, you know bits and bytes anyway, because you've been dealing with computers all this time. But in the late 1960s, this was very far away from anyone involved in the arts. Only a few artistic people dealt with computers. So I began programming in 1969. And I learned the fundamentals of programming. I typed onto punch cards, and the cards had holes in them that the computer read the cards, and then it wrote out whatever it was I was doing. And I did this for 2 years. As a sidelight from doing composition and working a bit in the studio and stuff like that. And I looked at this and I said, I have only 28 hours in a day, and I only have 8.5 days a week. In that much time, I can do so much. And this thing called a bit, or the computer stuff, will just add another 4 hours to every day. So I said, what I will do is I won't actually get involved in the development of this, but I will stay completely in touch with the developments. So I made sure that my reading included all of the up-to-date stuff on computer development. And this becomes a circle, because as I found out more about how people were developing computers away from punch cards to magnetic tape and bits and blah, blah, and going from 8-bit to 16-bit and so on and so forth. It changed how I viewed what I was doing. And what I realized that as I changed the view, it didn't change my perception. In fact, it began to give me tools that my perception could use because the tools were more refined. Because I had mentioned about 15 minutes ago that when I was 5 or 6, I was noted for my really good pitch. I mean, really good pitch, not just good, but a whole other level. But I know people who have absolute pitch who can hear down to the interval of a fifth of a semitone. I could hear down to quite easily a tenth of a semitone and had no difficulty. And also with time, I had the same. But I couldn't find equipment and machinery and people who could consistently work down to this level of precision. So now you've begun to get a number of strands coming together. I've moved from the analog of the head cutter doing the recording. I've introduced the idea of multi-channel recording, which was developed for the BBs, and in the early 1950s, Bing Crosby funded the development of a multi-channel tape recorder and the first Ampex, 2 channels, and various. There's an interesting history of individual artists who wanted more layers available and more control of those layers, but they had to enter the digital age to do that. They had to enter the age where what would be given to them would look like it was analog, but in point of fact, the underlying structure was quantized. And you say, wait, quantized, is that like quantum mechanics, man? And I said, yeah, that's like quantum mechanics. Quantum physics says that things exist in discrete packets of something. They exist here, and they exist here, or they exist simultaneously in both of them. And all of a sudden I get, so if it's here or here, what do you call that? And they said, that's a bit. I said, oh, so that's information. Information is now at the metric level is quantizable, and therefore it becomes repeatable in the term exactly repeatable. It wasn't dependent upon the vagaries of the analog equipment that would make small shifts or changes. And if one's perception were at this level, in terms of time or whatever, the having higher rates of quantization meant that I would be able to reproduce materials at the level of complexity and precision that I was able to hear them. This is again a circle, because the generation after me grew up in this world, and the generation after me, in terms of their hearing and their discrimination and interest, I can say this because I've done this for a long time, starting in the early 1980s, the people I was beginning to see, and they were 20, so they were born 1960. And then in the 1990s, I was born in 1970, and the year 2000, I was born in 1980. Every decade, the quality of the hearing of the people coming into electroacoustics.
That's fascinating.
Wow.
Because I had been tracking it, I could see it. But I spoke to other people about this, and they didn't know what I was talking about.
The quality in what sense? Like in perception or just...
in perception.
Wow. Okay.
Because they were born into a world of much greater clarity, precision. And because they were born into that world, the brain, which is a marvelous device up between my ears, isn't it? Going on in there, honey pie, believe you me. In that's untapped. For 90% of what's up there, in the billion synapses and the trillion paths through the brain, most of that is not used. And what was missing historically, it's not missing, it just wasn't there, because my use of the word technology is a very broadly based word. The technology hadn't advanced to the level of precision that was anywhere close to the capacity of the human brain to do these things. And the mechanical digital analog technology of the last 50, 70 years since the Germans invented the tape recorder and the film came in and blah, 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 all that stuff, means that the people of your generation, those born roughly 1990-ish, they're a little in the 90s, there was a fundamental ground shift in electroacoustics, in the people's desire for education in sound. And one of the fundamental shifts, very slow, it took 10, 15, 20 years to occur, was that I stopped introducing sound to people. I spent the first 20 years of my teaching playing weird sounds at people and trying to get them interested in listening to weird sounds. And then slowly a few people came in and they would listen to this and they go, oh yeah, I got that. I go, are you sure? And they go, oh yeah, blah, 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 blah. And the language wouldn't be precise, but I had learned to listen underneath the words and to listen for the energy which was coming from people in this, because of my work in linguistics and stuff. And there was a shift starting kind of in the early 80s from the people I was seeing in the 70s who were born 1955, 52, 55, 60. These are all rough figures, but the census right. Starting around 1980, there was a new generation that was creeping in. So that by 1980, the first year electronic music course, as it was called at that time, had 18 in it. The first year I took electronic music, there were 7 at the beginning and 2 dropped out in the first week. And of the 5 that remained, 2 of them struggled with this thing, and it never happened for them. And then there were the 3 of us who, I was a duck to water when I got into the studio. I was a duck to water. You started in the studio at Concordia or wherever you had studied, and you'd been given 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 hours a week in the studio. So because in 1969, when I went into the studio, there were only eventually 3 of us. I said to the studio director, Van Aanholt, my composition teacher, we were given 3 hours a week to work in there. They figured that we would get enough and 3 hours or maybe 4 hours to do it. I said to him after the first week, I said to him, actually it was Paul Peterson who was teaching the course, but I said to him, Professor Peterson, I still call people professor in those days. I eventually called him Paul. It took me about 6 weeks to stop calling him professor, which was very unusual. People didn't refer to the professors by their first name.
I found it unusual when you asked us to refer to you with the first name, but I soon became comfortable with it.
Yeah, because I'm not professor or Mr. whatever, doctor, blah, 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 all that. And so after the first week, I said to Professor Peterson, can I get 2 blocks a week? Can I get 2 4-hour blocks in the week? And he said, yes. And I said, oh, good. I have 8 hours a week I can work in the studio. And the next week when we went in the class, he listened to the tape I'd done, which is about 8 seconds of something or other. He said, did you ring modulate that? And I said, no, I dubbed it twice and played one of them backwards as half speed. And he said, that sounds like ring modulation. You sure you didn't use the ring modulator? And I said, no, it's the microphone in the bottom of the bucket with some metallic stuff on top. And I shook it. And then I realized that my hearing was on another planet compared to what he was hearing. He is 15 years my senior. He was born in 1933. He's one of the pioneers of electronic music in Canada, having started working at UTEMS, University of Toronto Electronic Music Studio, in 1954. But in the 12 years he had worked in the studios, his hearing had slowly progressed. But I came from another generation. After the second week, I said to him, can I get more time than that? And he said, how much do you want? And I said, can I get 20 hours? I thought I'd be told 10 would be the limit. And he said, okay, I'll get you a key for the studio. So this studio, which you used to have to go through security to get the key for, he gave me a key. And then from the third week on, I spent on average 24 hours a week in the studio until Christmas, until December. And then when classes were ended, I spent between 8 and 12 hours a day in there for 3 weeks. The only day I took off was Christmas Day when I went to see my mother. But the rest of the time, there was no documentation. A Moog synthesizer came in, and I looked at it, and there was one manual by a guy named Donald Pellegrino, and it was unreadable. There was no theory. Nobody had written a book on how modular synthesis works, except that you have to make it sound like a trumpet, you do this. I wasn't interested in making it sound like a trumpet. I wanted to know, being of the nature I am, I wanted to know everything about it before it began. By the end of the first holidays, by the end of the December holidays, beginning early January, I had spent 40 to 50 hours a week in the studio for 5 weeks. And I covered about as much material in that 250 hours as the first year electroacoustic courses covers in about 20 weeks of 3 hours a week. What took me 250 or 300 hours, people today coming into the studio, your generation, you move through this like lightning. The S assignment, the unvoiced phonemes assignment, which people still swear at sometimes.
That was a personal frustrator, but I think that it really sets the level. It lets you know what to expect. Like this is what it's about.
Yeah, definitely. I didn't hate it though.
And people were being the unvoiced constants, and I would say, "Oh no, you have wind noise on that. You can't use that because I have wind noise." And they go, "What? What wind noise?" And I said, "Well, look at the spectrogram." If we do spectrograms in the first week, who does spectrograms in the first week?
Yeah.
We do.
So
And I said, wind noise is low frequency noise. Where's the low frequency? And the design, the general design of the program at Concordia was based upon my comprehension of what it is this genius generation I was dealing with every year had to rise to achieve these levels. And therefore, the program and what I do in the educational side of that, one of the key terms, if you think about it, would be education. There's only one small part of what I am. And that's not a small part, it's a large part of what I do. But my understanding of this was based upon my inability to communicate with people. Mm-hmm. And what are you doing in communication, in education, if you can't communicate? And the answer is, well, I was learning how to communicate. And I had a long history of just fucking things up all over the place. In 1972, I was recording a music educators conference. I was recording it because I was the technician, blah, blah. And I was at one set of presentations one day, and they were talking about ear training. They were talking about how to sing intervals and how to teach triads. And this was going on for like an hour and a half. And I was sitting there getting more and more annoyed. And at the end of the presentations of these 4 or 5 highly reputed, touted ear training teachers from across Canada, they said, "Are there any questions?" And there were going to be questions like, "Well, how do I teach the perfect fourth descending when the blah, blah?" And I put up my hand and I said, "I don't understand this. You're dealing with a generation that's going to live with ring modulators. You're not teaching them what filters and ring modulators do." And there was silence in the place. It was like I had farted an enormous, huge, ugly, smelling, loud fart. Everyone was silent and everyone froze. And at the time I thought, I've really fucked this up. What have I done here? And I said, I live in a world where what ear training is about isn't simply notes and rhythms. It's about developing the individual's inner and outer ear. It's about having the individual being able to continue their own education as a lifetime of education, developing, the instructor develops tools that the student in the class, because there are no students in the class, the person in the class who's studying this, what they're going to do is they're going to take these tools, and from then on, they're going to self-teach. And they will self-teach on a continuous basis. And the teaching will take the form of them changing their ability to perceive and categorize what it is they're dealing with. And I said, one of the difficulties here, I didn't say it this way at that time because I didn't have the vocabulary, but I said, one of the difficulties here is that this is, again, 50 years later, I'm saying this. The difficulties here is I'm proposing that people change. And apart from money, death, and change are the three things that people don't want to talk about. They'll talk about death before they'll talk about money. And between change and money, it's not possible. I find it impossible to start continuing in-depth conversations with people about change because it's so embedded in who they are. It's related to their identity as who they are. So these 3 or 4 or 5 people who stood up and spoke about intervals and notes and chords and that kind of stuff, I now understand why I was viewed as a threat in saying these things, because it took their model, their mythology of music, and it took it apart. I was lucky. I had a composition teacher, Ish Van Aanholt, who in 1968 was introduced to the voice of Janis Joplin. And in that year, he was introduced by a student when he was teaching in Buffalo for a semester. During that introduction to Janet Joplin's voice, he changed his entire understanding of the human voice. It was no longer about singing melodies. It was about direct, emotional, human communication. And I was blessed. I was in a class with a man who forced me to learn linguistics and psycholinguistics because that was his interest, and then brought me to listen to Janis Joplin and distorted voice and Luciano Berio and Sikenza, which led me to James Joyce and to Omajua Joyce, and then into all kinds of stuff, because I came from a very culturally impoverished background. I personally come from poverty. Poverty isn't only money. Poverty is a mind condition. My mother took the family out of poverty. My father could never have done that. My father lived within 2 kilometers of where he was born, basically for the first 40 years of his life. This is North London. This isn't the countryside. He just lived in this small circle and never thought that things could get better or change. My mother, bless her, wanted better for her children. And we picked up and we came to Canada, and carrying what today would be about a $40,000 debt, had to begin finding our way here. It was 500 pounds, 500 sterling pounds in 1957. My father was an unskilled laborer. He worked on the roads in London. And my mother, at the age of 14, had gone into trade school to learn tailoring, to become a tailor. But there's intelligence in both sides of the family. I was the first person to go to university in the entire family.
How did that feel?
It meant nothing because I didn't connect to things that way.
Okay.
See, I lived I came from a family that had no expectations of me. They wanted me to advance and to be whatever, educated. But my mother never told me what to do. She never criticized me. There's a weirdness here. My father, very quiet man, said very few things to me, just occasionally. And what he said was things that were really, really important and really critical. But the rest of the time, he just did stuff for us. He took us out on Saturday afternoon, myself and my brother and sister, and we went to the park for 3 hours every Saturday afternoon just to walk down to the park to allow my mother 3 hours of time alone, because he was a very kind, gentle man who placed the family as important, but he could never have left England. He could never have left London. He was the sense of poverty. I call it with the slum condition, because slum is not living without money. A slum is a condition of the mind that is not going to extend beyond the barriers which are there. So all of these things subsequently in my life played into my understanding of how I was thinking of developing an educational program in some form or other. And they just had to reside there for 15 years before they were called upon. And because they resided there for 15 years, between the age of 5 and the age of 21, 22, I had learned a hard way sometimes, an extreme level of patience. If something didn't work out today, that's okay. Didn't work out this year, that's okay. Didn't work out this decade, that's okay. Because the Electroacoustic Studies program was designed basically in 1970-71 and became a program in the year 2000. And people said to me, you waited 30 years to get this program, and why didn't you just push it through? I said, because it's not in my nature to do things in a confrontational fashion. Because the people who oppose the introduction of this new technology, that's who they are. I can't impose, unlike Stephen Harper, or Donald Trump, I can't impose the conditions of change upon people. The conservative says they don't want controls from the government, they just want their controls instead of the government controls. If you just listen to Donald Trump talking, he always begins everything with, I'm as the president, I will do this. And the answer to him is, yeah, that's very nice, but we're not living in the 18th and 19th century anymore. We're living in a world which is finite and has 7 billion people in it. And while individual ego is very interesting, what's more important than individual ego is education and the development of human rights and many other things. And central to my thinking about this over the years has been something I heard or read decades ago. It said, think globally, act locally. Act locally, think globally. So my aims and objectives are based upon global perspectives. What I do is based upon, in particular in the teaching of this, is in the classroom, I don't care who's outside the door. My only interest is the people in the room. It only ever was that. It only ever was those who were in the room. The dean could be complaining about me. I don't care. That's none of my business. I am here to act locally. And sometimes this has led me to short-term pain. Sometimes it led me to a little bit longer pain, like being charged with professional misconduct. But the longer-term gain of this whole thing is that by staying focused on where I want this to go, even if I never get there, by staying focused on this, the change will be brought about by the people who are able to integrate change into their lives. Now I can place this at a local level. And you were asking me about electroacoustics, since it's essentially a large part of what this podcast is about how people in various ways deal with electroacoustics. And I know that in the classroom, with whether there's 17 or 25 or 35 people, I'm dealing with 17 or 25 or 35 individuals. I have real difficulty with the concept of an unnumbered quantity. I try to be very careful about using the word you and the word they, because these are categorizations that are delimiters for the mind's ability to understand the individual who is in front of them. So this is on my mind this is not just on my mind for the 45 minutes a week of thinking about this. This is on my mind with everything I do that involves individuals and other people. So this, for example, this podcast, I couldn't do this podcast with anyone but you two. What I'm saying to you is I can speak to you because I know enough about you individually that I can form my ideas and shape them in a different way. I did a similar kind of interview about 10 years ago with two guys from Vermont who are really, really good guys. And you can find them on the web. I can't remember the name, it'll come back. And I spoke to them anecdotally, but anecdotally at the level of the community. I'm speaking to you anecdotally at the level you have experienced what it is to be in the class. And you will, if you think about it, as you think about, it's a long time ago, but you have to try and, I'll give you a little test on this. Try and remember 5 times or even 3 times that I said no to something someone suggested.
You gotta give me a second. I don't think. I'm sure you have. No, I'm kidding. Right.
I can't think of any off the top of my head.
That's true. You never did.
Yes, because I was blessed from the time of my mother never criticizing me and never telling me not to do something. She knew that if I did something bad, I would learn from it, which I did. I did all kinds of crap around the house, in the apartment, and she would just give me a nudge and say, what do I do? I go, okay. I wouldn't do it again. I didn't need to be. And my school teachers knew I was weird, and they gave me latitude. They just let me do whatever it was. I sat in my grade 9 geometry class in the front desk, in the front row on the right-hand side of the classroom, while the instructor was teaching geometry. I sat there doing German to English translation of Das Lied von der Erde of Mahler. So I had the score open and my German-English dictionary next to it. And I was sitting there and I was doing the translation. And others in the class were looking at me going, he's not paying attention. How is he going to get through this course? And sometime around December or something in the class, something came up about whatever it was in geometry. And the teacher asked a particularly complex question. And I was sitting there doing my translation of Mahler. And I stopped and I realized that no one in the class was answering the question. It was a combinatorial question. It combined together the elements that he had been teaching in the class, and now it was up to the students to put these things together. I do this in the class on a regular basis. I would bring the class a question in the EA class that everyone in the class had covered the information, but only a few people had integrated the information. And so the teacher asked this question, and I listened to it as I was doing that, and I sat up, and no hands went up. And he looked at me and said, Kevin, and I gave him the answer. And I knew from a few things, I was quite insensitive to social anything. But I just had the sense that something had changed in some of my friends who thought I was actually just a crazy musician doing translations of this. And then one of them said something to me, a guy who eventually went to Oxford and did his doctoral work. So he said to me, when did you know that? I said, well, I knew that when I was 6. He said, "You have been doing geometry since grade 1?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "When I was 5, I knew my 12 times table, and I could divide by fractions, and I could do area when I was 7. And it was in grade 4, at the age of 9, that fractions were introduced into the class. So I was given enormous latitude because of the irregularity of what I had learned and how I had learned it. So I learned to do this with the classes as well. And I would challenge people on what they had to say. And I challenged them on the precision that they address it in.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like sloppy articulation of ideas. And I only challenged people who had really got to a fundamental point in understanding things. And then they were ready to make their step to the next place. And I viewed this many times. And what I see is I no longer ask or expect any kind of feedback from the class on these things, because only 2 or 3 people in the class will get it at that moment. And you may remember I said many years ago, we were probably doing synthesis, and I said, Hugh Lacane, who you know from Gypsody and the Sackbut, was doing a class at McGill. And Hugh Lacane's mind was just somewhat. And I asked him how an octave equalizer worked. You've used third band and octave equalizer, you use them all the time. I said to him, how does the circuit know the frequency it's working on? And he understood my question. So my question was, how does this slider know only to affect these frequencies? And he understood the question, but he wasn't going to answer the question I presented him with, because he knew I was asking a different question, but I didn't know it at the time. And I said, I don't understand how this 1K fader, how the circuitry can know not to affect those other frequencies. And he said, Kevin, it's all only amplitude.
Soundspace is proudly sponsored by Laser Audio Technologies. Use code SOUNDSPACE for 30% off any purchase. Transform your sound with Glow, a mass granulator, or with the modern degradation of codec by visiting laser.io today.
I remember your classrooms when we would ask a question, or at least from my experience, when I would ask a question, you would come back to me with another question and another question until I answer my own question. And you answer it by asking me questions around my question, kind of making us really think about what we're
No, say me. You can't say us. You can't speak for
I can't speak for other people. So at least for me, allowing me to think about what I'm really asking and answering my question that way.
The us could be Anthony and I, because I'm with them on that. Yeah.
Thank you. So I think that was very fascinating, and I've thought about that method of teaching for a while, because at first it was a little frustrating. Like, okay, I'm asking this question, give me an answer. I want to know I want to know.
Give me an answer. It's such a yeah.
But by the end of that semester, even I completely appreciated that method, because it really pushed me to understand what I'm asking, it made me understand what I need to know.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know?
I agree.
And as happens, you just described exactly what happens. The moment you could ask the question correctly, you had the answer.
Exactly. It's all articulation, and
it was all in the reducing the question
Mm.
from a bigger question, and
Yeah.
sometimes into smaller questions, and other times just peeling away all the shit that's attached to it because you were reading it in some magazine.
Yeah. It was either that or it was most of the time the answer was read the course outline, but and
To anyone who
Evidently.
went to Electroacoustic Studies with Anthony and I, that moment was for you.
evidently the answer was most of the time
The course outline.
outline. You thought about it.
Absolutely.
Like, yep, this is a frequently asked question. I'm just gonna throw it in there.
No, I didn't think about it. I didn't think about this. This is the secret I learned in the 70s of my 10 years of a mixture of genius and bullshit teaching.
Right.
No, it was 10 years. I was supported by the chair of the department for 10 years on this.
Okay.
Give brilliant classes. I will give absolute garbage classes. And I slowly managed to refine this. Do you remember at the back of the course outline?
The list of words?
Like the back of my hand.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so how many were there?
Thousands.
No, not for you. Not in 2016. In 2016, there were probably like 700.
Okay, it felt like thousands. Yeah.
Now there are 1,500.
Oh my. Jeez.
And what's the last one?
Oh, I don't remember.
Xylophone?
No, it begins with Z. Zen Buddhist hot dog.
Wait, actually?
You know what a Zen Buddhist hot dog is?
I really couldn't say.
I don't think it exists.
It's one with everything.
Oh.
If you think about that for a while, it took one person 5 years to get that joke.
I still don't get it. I'm sorry.
When you get a hot dog, they say, what do you want on it? And you say, everything. Right?
Everything, yeah, sure.
What is Zen Buddhism? The objective of Zen Buddhism is for one with everything.
Oh,
Oh,
Zen Buddhist all time. Oh, wow. Okay.
I met someone recently, maybe a year or two after you were there, who's at McGill right now, doing his master's, and I went to visit him, and he was in a lab in the room with 5 other master's students, and so we sat around. We had a chat, and he was trying to explain the electroacoustic experience at Concordia, which is in the possibility. You have to be there. You as an individual cannot explain to someone who has not been in there and sat through the theater and the farce and the mess and the jokes and the didactic methods and all that. It's not possible to explain this. It's called experiential. And my experience in the classes is that those people, those individuals who are able to integrate this sense of being inquisitive about everything into their lives, I have finished anything I need to do with them in terms of being in the classroom with them. The same way that you learned that when you had a question, you had to reduce the question and you had to do research on it. And if there was something you didn't get, then the resources exist in the university or in the class or from whatever.
right.
To come and say, I don't get this. But at the beginning of this podcast, I gave you a brief history of Western European culture and technology. I gave it to you in about 4 minutes. And you didn't get lost at all. Everything I gave as an example was something you could associate yourself with in terms of your own experience.
Right.
And therefore, I work very abstractly, but I work very concretely in the way the abstractions are presented, because that's how my mind works. And therefore, what I have learned from the classes, from everyone in the classes, those who do brilliantly and those who kind of get lost somewhere along the way, whatever it is, what I've learned from the classes is how within myself I can find 15 ways of saying the same thing, the same meaning. Yeah. I have a nodule in here of the thing, and I need to express this to people who have done 2 years of recording classes and people who have played 7 years in a guitar rock garage band, and people who want to do sound design for films, and people who, or whatever, because they've come together because they have a passion for sound. Case in point, the two of you.
In this podcast.
And this podcast. And you have picked up on something I have hinted at for a long time in classes, but never directly said, which is the importance of producing and collecting information so that other people at other times in other places, without your knowledge or ability to control it, will have access to this information. I listened to the beginning of LDADs, and I learned more about LDAD in the first 10 minutes of that podcast about particular aspects of LDAD than I had known about him for the past 15 years.
That's a big compliment.
You were able to get him to, I've seen him do that before, but you created the environment, your good combination of creating the environment that allows you, when necessary, to ask questions, and on the other hand, when not necessary, to not ask the question and just allow the evolution of the event you're doing. I think you have a winning team here.
Thank you. You're giving me chills.
Yeah.
I'm going to pass a few names on to you, do interviews, and I will make a few suggestions as to how to make some small modifications to get your podcasts to a different kind on a wider group. For example, the big one, of course, is the duration of the podcast. I watch the chess channels. I don't know if you're chess people, but
a little bit. I play a little bit.
Do you watch them? Do you go to the YouTube channels?
No, I don't. But I just, it's I don't know. I enjoy playing chess once in a while. It's a good relaxer.
Wow.
Yeah, I like watching chess. And his name is Agadmon or something, Agadm. He has 1.5 million views of his chess. He has 1.25 million followers. You know what? This is chess. I mean, it's big, but we're not talking 200,000 here. We're talking serious numbers. And he apologizes when his analysis of the game is more than 15 minutes. And now I want more than 15 minutes, but I don't want more than 15 minutes in one shot. And he's very good at doing he wasn't a grandmaster, he was a master. He's about your age, about 30. And he's very clear that he doesn't have to do everything all the time. Because if he has people coming back to him day in, day out, and it's 12, 11, I think the shortest he's done is the shortest was 3 minutes. It was a very, very, very cute, but basically the shortest was 7 to 9 minutes. And they're usually between 11 and 14 minutes, which is it doesn't impose upon my time. Other ones which are 27 minutes, I start them and I put it into pause and I leave them in my tab bar up top, and I seldom get back to them.
Right.
And what you're doing right now is you're doing the heavy lifting and doing the longer.
Right.
This is not an interview. I'm sorry. This is a Kevin Austin monologue again. It's just the way my mind works. But you have allowed for the flow, and what you could consider, because you clearly have a very broad understanding of what it is, because you work with electronics and you work in broadcast industry and you work with broadcast people, and they have all kinds of reasons for doing this. And the podcasts could be that you just invite someone to talk for 15 minutes about one thing.
They could be, absolutely. No, I
Right.
see what you mean. A lot of people consume media nowadays at a faster speed. You have the ability to double the speed or anything. Does that factor into anything you were
No, they
saying?
don't.
What do you mean by no?
Well, because they're dealing with a human thing.
Mm-hmm.
So what is the brain's ability to decode verbal information? How many bits a second?
I couldn't tell you. Do you know?
Yeah. So what you do is you go and you look this up, and you tell me if the human vein has changed its structure in the past, I don't know, 200,000 years.
That's such a Kevin Austin way to put it, and I love it. I see what you mean.
But wait, but you see, I covered this before.
Yes.
Well, if you were paying
You did.
attention, I said to you that only some small percentage of the brain is being used.
Yes. Yeah. And 10% and 90%. I remember. Yeah.
But then you described a situation of effectively increasing the bit rate,
Right.
providing the information. And my experience here, and your experience might getting you to trim the question down. When you have having a question in your head and you've removed the extraneous elements, when you've removed the noise from it and you've focused on what it is you're trying to do, it didn't have to be done quickly. It's because it wasn't inside all of this fluff, which is just the noise in the system.
Mhm.
So if the information you wish to convey is concentrated and is devoid of extraneous noise, that would be the equivalent of speeding up the flow of information. We've been going for an hour. I have a question for you about this conversation. Have I given you an opinion on anything except Donald Trump?
I would say in politics, but that was going to be the only thing I was going to say. No, I don't think you have.
No, not really.
Have you had another
Yes.
discussion
Yeah.
with anybody in your podcast who in an hour didn't give an opinion, didn't give their opinion about something?
I don't think so. But you're unique. You have to understand. There's not many people like you, Kevin. You know what I mean?
No.
What I'm trying to say is that you're extremely unique.
Everyone is extremely unique.
No, but you're particularly extremely unique. Is what I'm trying to get at.
Wait, I'll go and get you with thesaurus so you can use
We'll be here all night. We'll hit 2 hours with.
a long string of words to talk about the
No, but it's true. It's true.
Yeah.
And what will happen in conversations with you is that we'll go for a length of time, and then you'll bring up a point like this. Like, do you realize that I did not give a single opinion in the last entirety of this podcast? And then it'll be a moment of, oh man, that's what? And it's great.
Yeah.
It's great.
It's great in a sense that like how many layers you think in when you're speaking or when you're answering a question, especially when you're answering a question, you kind of start by telling a story, and then what it feels like it's no longer related, but you somehow bring it back and you go full circle and you answer the question.
I don't actually answer the question. I bring you to the conclusion that is the conclusion you wanted to the question you were asking. The answer to the question is not whether or not I can answer the question. It is whether or not you can integrate the result of the question into yourself. And therefore, if I were to quote something or whatever it was going to be, or give you a blah, 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 blah answer, or cool or hip or whatever, all these buzzwords. I'm sorry, I really can't handle those. They're completely meaningless to me. Because what I have learned to do in my own self-teaching is that I work on the integration into me. Very self-centered idea. But I think that it's about the individual coming to recognition of, to use your word for the moment, uniqueness, and to use the word at the other end of that continuum, which is one with everything. And this idea that the individual, my experience in this, is that more or less I can live in many hundreds of what are in Buddhism called the 3,000 worlds. So at any moment in time, stylized in this particular form of Buddhism called Soko Gakkai, which is Japanese Buddhism, stylized in the 3,000 worlds, is that people are different from each other. An acceptance of the fact that people are different from each other is a path forward. And therefore, I work on developing in my head the ability to live in many more of these worlds at the same time. So everything, one of the reasons when you invited me onto this, you sent me the first draft, I read it and I said, well, it's a good start. If it had been a different kind of document, I would have said, oh, guys, I'm really busy. I can't. But it wasn't that. It needed a haircut. Like I need a haircut. See? You
don't need a haircut, Kevin. No, you're known for that hair. Please don't get a haircut.
Because it's not about me. It's about the you. And my place in the classroom is about the you, which makes doing recorded presentations like this more complex for me, because I need to think about how any of the 21 or 200 or 7,000 or 35,000 people who will come to this will experience this. And that may or may not mean anything to me whatsoever. It may or may not mean anything to you whatsoever. And when you assemble this podcast, when you assemble this whatever, it's a performance, it's a monologue performance. When you assemble this, you will find there are things you'll put into different parts of the flow, but you'll also find that it's not going to be easy to move things about from the last hour and 45 minutes, because what I'm saying right now is based upon what you have experienced in the previous time. And it's this control of the flow of time that I have learned being a slow learner. It took me a long time to learn. It's this control of the flow of time. Because you've chosen to go into production, I will talk to you about this. Because we worked through 3-4 drafts of your questions. Remember?
Yeah, about that.
Yeah.
So you kind, I guess you kind of collectively discussed this, and then one of you wrote the draft.
We both wrote it. We both
wrote it.
And we both edited each other, and yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
But you agree that you have to begin by giving a frame of reference for who I am and the fact that I studied composition and I did this and I played tuba in the Bavarian band and that
which I would like to talk about at some point.
In München steht ein Hofbräuhaus, 1, 2, I just sent him away. My experience has been very wide.
Absolutely. Your experience has been very wide. And I think that, like what you said earlier about the drafts that we were going through, I think, like you said, this is not an interview. This is more of a conversation. And I don't even think, like this second year of the podcast, we decided to restructure things and do like a recording intro. I don't even think we're going to record some sort of intro. I just want to jump into it, and I just want to talk about it with you. That's what it feels like, these conversations that you have with people, they reshape the way we see things. I don't know if you're seeing what I mean. I'm learning a lot about myself just through listening to you. Now I feel like I'm part of the audience, although I am hosting at the very moment.
That's one of the things you'll learn about production. Production is, I've done production for a long time, and you need to be a successful producer, you need to have that bifurcation or trifurcation in your head. You have to have all the technical stuff at hand.
Mm-hmm.
You have to have all of the linguistic stuff at hand.
Yeah.
And you have to be the listener who is coming to this for the first time. Even though you've spent 7 hours editing this thing, when you come to listen to it as its near finished state, you have to
It's very hard to be subjective.
You have to clean. Yeah, you have to clean your ears to do that. And I have there's a trick to doing that, by the way.
What is the trick?
Do tell.
It's to develop what I call different modes of listening.
Modes of listening.
Yeah.
Can you walk through some of them with us? Well, all of them with us?
No, I'll give you an example from it is mind training more than that.
Okay.
So there was someone in the class is very talented. He's done composition actually. He's done 4 or 5 years of composition. He's in the class and played a piece the other day, and I listened to it, and I put on my spectral ears. All I listened to was the spectral content, the tone color aspects of the piece. Whatever. So, marvelous piece, very well formed. But I only listened to this what spectral morphology in one sense, but a little less clear than that. I listened to it like looking at my face, and you see the white dot on the end of my nose.
I do.
Yeah. Yes.
You see it's white.
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
Doesn't it bother you? I have a white dot on the end of my
No.
nose
Well,
because
I'm curious.
stand that the white dot is just a reflection of the light.
Mm-hmm.
You can see it as being a reflection of light, or you can see it as being like I've put a white dot there to be a clown.
I mean, we're a bit all clowny, I would say.
No, but you see, if I say to you, I'm a clown with white paint on my face, you can see the white as being paint.
Right.
And if I see over here,
Yeah.
the white is gone. It's only the pink face and the red there. And if I ask you to tell me the colors of my face, the colors you will say are going to be red.
Yeah, red undertone. Yeah.
Right.
And now I just want you to look at my eyes.
I mean, we're audio only for the podcast. I don't know.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't
Okay.
matter. I want
Okay.
you to look at my
I'm
eyes.
looking at your eyes. This is going to be so entertaining on the audio version.
Okay, wait. Just
Yeah, okay.
Just
I'm looking.
describe my eyes.
They're blue.
They're blue. Yeah.
Are they moving?
Yes, they are moving.
Side to side.
Well, say they're moving for
They're
goodness
moving
sake.
from side to side.
They're moving in circles, right?
circles.
Yeah, you're looking around the room.
Good.
Oh, there was a blink. Yeah.
Omnidirectional, you know.
During that time,
Yeah.
you didn't see the color of my face.
No, I did not.
No, because I was
And
focusing on,
I
focusing
knew you were
on
going
the
to ask
eyeballs.
that, but that's true.
That's what the multiple modes of listening are.
Yeah. Wow.
So I
Wow.
listened to this piece.
Mhm.
I listened to it as a tone color piece, just spectral stuff.
Okay.
And the second time, because he was doing a presentation, he said something and someone said something, and I thought, oh, yeah, okay. And then he played it again, and it's made up of orchestral instruments. It's all made up of orchestral samples.
MIDI.
So I listened to it as an orchestral piece. And I listened to the instruments that he was using to do the piece. And I didn't hear the spectrum. I identified the sources of the sounds in the piece. And then I remapped the piece in my head based upon whether he was using strings or woodwinds or percussion or choir, which he does at one point. And then I decided what I would do. I would listen not simply to the orchestral quality, but I would listen to the harmonic quality. I would abstract it one step even further.
Well, how do you strip those apart with your ears? Like, how do you only focus on one sound? Like, if I hear an orchestral sound, it'll be hard for me to not recognize that sound and just not focus on that aspect of it. So how do you really focus on that? I presume practice.
I'm not going to recommend this on air. It's probably doing a little bit of acid at some point will help you just dissociate things. You've seen Picasso's paintings when he has the model with an eye somewhere other than on just the two sides of the nose. You still recognize it as an eye, but there's no problem with it being somewhere on the other side of the head or the ear being somewhere else. because you accept that it's both a gestalt and a gestalt made up of individual elements, individual in sound parameters. So the next time I listened to it as a cinematographic scene. I listened to it and I thought, this is a film shot. It's 6 minutes long. What's happening? What am I looking at on the screen? And what is that doing to me purely in terms of what's happening on how fast is the camera moving? Is it panning? Is it dollying? Is it zooming? Is it light? Is it dark? What are the colors? Darker colors with darker greens, and there's a window just here. And then there's the choir that comes in, but the choir, I saw there was a light in the corner of the room. And as it went over there, I could see the halo of light around the lamp that was there, and it moved away and that disappeared. So I simply looked at it and projected into my mind a cinematographic scene. And then I did it as a soundscape, which removed all of the object elements. And I simply listened to it as if I were walking down the street. And it was a really weird soundscape. But I was able to make it, I won't say it was science fiction or speculative fiction, but it was definitely at a distance, because it was very much more dreamlike than the actual physical walking down a street, because the composer was free to bring in things and take them out. Therefore, as I was going through this space I was seeing this in, there would be things which would appear and they would move somewhere and then they would disappear. And there would be multiple layers of them. And I could recognize that at this point, there were 2 or 3 things happening. And I didn't have to know what they were. I just used my mind to see these things happening, and whatever it was. And he's quite a brilliant piece in some ways, because he also, by and large, used orchestral samples that had reverb on them, as orchestral samples tend to have. Right. And he added little bits of reverb. But he also had gone out and got some dry samples of percussion and woodwinds. And in this thing he was doing, it's incomplete. In this thing he was doing, he would bring a sound forward like this, and it would be there without reverb. It was outside. It wasn't outside the environment. It meant it was like this. It was right in front of my nose. Any reverb which would have been added in a sound which is very close, you don't get the reverberational characteristic of space from it. And I have spent decades doing this all the time. In the kitchen, making pancakes, I do it all the time. I pick up the egg, and I pick up the knife to break the shell of the egg. And before I bring it down, I imagine the sound of that sound. And I will do it at more distance or closer, without consciously deciding one way or the other. But using this to build up my database of information I can access when I want to do this. And one of the things that you may recall at various times I showed was how to take 2 sounds, and I'm not going to use the word mix because it's not quite an accurate term. Transform one towards the other, which is much easier to explain to people today because they have the experience in films.
Like transform as in moving from speaker to speaker.
Yeah, transformers kind of thing.
Right. That actually, we worked quite a bit in that while we were at Concordia, working especially in multi-channel, because we worked a lot in multi-channel.
I'd love to talk about multi-channel.
I kind of want to talk a little bit more into the multi-channel aspect, because I'm particularly curious to hear your take on multi-channel, whether it be 5.1, 8.1, and how it enhances the listening experience?
So my history of multi-channel sound.
Let's get into your history of multi-channel
Yeah.
sound. I think that's something we have to discuss. I think it's one of those points that we don't want to skip, just because I just want to give personal experience just to lead into this question and to put it a bit more. I did a music college degree, and everything was stereo. Everything was stereo. All I knew about the audio domain was like a stereo image, in a sense, how it was contained. And then we get to Concordia, and we're talking about front left, front right, back left, back right, and
center.
And center, of course.
Important.
And can't forget about center. I was doing a dramatic pause, just so you know. So let's please get into your history.
I was always interested in sounds from different places, different locations. There's a history in Western music of putting 2 or 3 ensembles in different places in the space and having them play either together or play independently of each other.
In the space of sound?
The space of sound. Nice. Nicely played.
San Marco in Venice has a cathedral. And the cathedral in San Marco in Venice is a Greek cross, which is a less elongated cross, and it has balconies, 3 balconies in the front and an organ in the back. And starting in the 1500s, early 1500s, the music directors would put 3 choirs up in the balconies up here, and one at the back of and they would sing antiphonally. They would sing backwards and forwards to each other. One would sing, the other one would answer. That one would sing, and all of it, and then they'd sing together. In other words, you had the spatialization working to open up the texture of the sound. Because when you were inside, as a listener, if you were to go there, it's worth a while. But you have the experience already, so it's less startling. But in
Definitely
the 1600s, you can imagine that people have only listened to the 6 singers standing in front of them singing the madrigal, suddenly are in this space where there are 3 ensembles where the sound not only is answering backwards and forwards between the voices, but answering backwards and forwards in space. So the space of sound, or the sound of space, opens up. And one is in front, and the organ is in the back behind. And then at one point, they put 2 organs in there. So it's possible to compose pieces for 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different ensembles. But they play together. Henry Brandt, B-R-A-N-T, was a Montreal-born composer who lived in New York City in the early part of the 20th century. And he met an early 20th century composer whose name you may or may not know, called Charles Ives. He changed the history. Actually, his father changed the history of Western music in terms of space. Charles Ives' father, he lived in Danbury, Connecticut, and his father used to have events he planned for July the 4th. And the town had a town square, and on the town square there were 3 churches and 4 roads. And what Charles Ives' father would do is he would get the 4 local bands, military bands mostly, and put one of them on the end of each of the 4 streets, and he would have the church doors opened, and then he would have the churches play hymns and ring their bells, and the 4 bands would march together into the square playing 4 different pieces simultaneously. Polymetric, polytonal, 6, 7 layers, and the musicians would pass through each other in this way. It would be cacophony.
Immersive cacophony.
Immersive, completely. Backwards, forwards, side, bells up in the air, the organs, blah, blah, blah. And then the bands would walk away and they'd go back down their streets. And so the listener in the square would have this cacophony, and then the 4 would separate, and where the individual was standing is where they would hear whichever band was closest to them at the time. And then the organs would stop playing and the bells would stop. And it would be. So Charles Ives, the son of the father, began writing orchestral pieces in which he required 2 and 3 conductors on the stage, because the orchestra was broken up into 2 or 3 units, which would be playing effectively different pieces metrically and tonally. And he said that we're talking late 1890s, early 1900s. This is really weird, really, really weird. But his father was doing this in the 1880s and 1870s, which is really mind-bogglingly complex. But Charles Ives wanted to have the audience understand the feeling of being immersed in the celebration. And there's a piece called 4th of July, where the bands are going on all over the place, and then the whole thing explodes with the fireworks, and the fireworks die away, and all that's left is the high strings being the cosmic radiation in the background. So a very philosophical take on this. So I read about these things when I began studying music, I was 17, because before that time I had some music, but I had no formal introduction to it. No one in the family does music.
Okay.
I come from. That's a difference. I went to McGill, and I met people whose brothers and sisters played instruments and whose parents were involved in music. Here I knew nothing. So I sat down and just listened to 5,000 pieces over a period of 5 years and read 20% of the library.
So you really started from scratch.
In terms of quantum information, yes. But my blessing was that my ear was, that when I went to Conservatoire, I did the first 5 years of the dictation program in 5 weeks. After the first week, I was moved to the second year. After the second week, I was moved to the third year. The third year, moved to the fourth. I was 13 doing dictation at a level where I couldn't correctly notate it because I didn't have enough theory. And I was in a class with 2 people, 1 hour a week with this tremendous, tremendous teacher who was just brilliant. He showed me how to teach ear training. But it's essentially what he did was he would play this melody or something, late 19th century, quite chromatic, quite difficult to do. He would play it, he would say, he was blind, Gabriel Cusson, and he would play the chord underneath of this. And he'd play it once through about 8 measures or 12 measures, not short, not 4 notes at a time, and he would say, "Well, Mr. Austin, how did you find that?" And I said, I was inarticulate. I was 13. I couldn't speak. I said, I think I need to hear it again. He said, "I would play it twice more for you." And he would play it once and give me 30 seconds, and he'd play it again. And the 2 of us would write down what it was. They said, "Well, Mr. Austin, gentlemen, marvelous. Can you tell me what you have written down?" And I said, "I'm not sure it's quite right." And he would say, "Please, just..." And I would read back to him what I had written down, 12 measures. This requires memory. And he would say, "Mr. Austin, that is a beautiful melody, but it's not quite what I played." He would play it, and I would go, "Oh," every time I made a mistake, he played the mistake. And every time, because my memory remembered the original, and because he played the mistake and didn't correct me, he allowed me to do the comparison. You'll notice comparison is important in how I approach the class. I compare things. This was here. I've done this to it. This is the result. So my ear training became one very much of understanding that people teach themselves the way a child teaches themselves, which is through trying something, finding there's an error, and then working on correcting the error without having to be told that it's not correct. So when you as a child learn to speak, if you made a mistake, your mother may or may not have corrected you. My mother never corrected me. All she did was, I don't know whether she wasn't interested enough or whatever it was, but because both of my parents, they were uneducated, but they were articulate, intelligent people. They didn't correct me. I listened to BBC and I listened to people speak, and I learned how to create the patterns. And without the correction coming from outside, it was an auto-correcting situation. So I had to develop inside my head an imagery, an imagination for what the sound was, and didn't do this simply with sounds that came to me from one place. I listened to many things at the same time. So I was at McGill, and I had read about these multi-channel things that had gone on performances. And when I was, it was 1969, I went into the McGill studio for the first time. But there was something before that. But in 1969, I went in the studio, and there were 4 speakers, one in each corner, because the thinking was to do multi-channel. I was the only person to use the 4-channel speakers for about 3 years. In 1968, in 1967, Montreal had a world exposition. It closed, and the following year, one of the pavilions, because it was a different time, was opened, and a man in Montreal, an audio shop dealer, proposed to install a 12-channel sound system to play pieces. And he did. And then they needed to have pieces to play. So they commissioned 2 recordings in London of an orchestra playing, but they recorded on 2-inch 16-channel tape, but they needed 4 channels open, as I explained in a moment. So they had a 12-channel tape, and this was 12 channels of close-mic'd recording. And now, close micing had been used by Columbia Records on the New York Philharmonic in the early 60s. And Bernstein employed this where you could focus in on the instrument for a moment and then back away. But in this case, because they were close mic'd in 12 sections of the orchestra, the flute always came out of this speaker, and the cellos always came out of that speaker, and the horns always came out of that speaker. And there were 12 of them. And there were 4 in the corners, and there were 8 in a cube in the middle of the space. The audience sat in a square, essentially, looking in at this box, this thing in the middle, a sculpture with 8 speakers, one on each of the corners of this suspended cube. There, 8 channels there, with each of them had 4 speakers, because they focused both this forwards and backwards and left and right. So wherever one sat in the space, they were directly in front of every loudspeaker in the space. It was a 12-channel system, and there were 4 subwoofers, unheard of in the time, in the corners. And each of these channels had 3 channels of color lights that would turn on and off with the sounds going to them. So when the flute played, that speaker up there would have little red lights turning on and off. And when the cellos played, blue ones over there. And
Yeah.
So evidently it was also a light show.
It was a light show.
Multimedia.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, absolutely. 30 channels. And the piece they used was a piece by the Italian composer Luciano Berio, and it's called Sinfonia, and Sinfonia is a really weird piece. And people who went there didn't like it, but they got really freaked out by the experience of sitting in this space, this square. It only sat about 60 people, 15 on each side. It was not huge. It was quite compact, and it was acoustically dead. The guy who designed it, and they went to Paul Peterson, who was the director of the studio at McGill, and Paul, they asked him to program the lights. So he took the score and he did the programming, but he couldn't do it because he needed to have 2 people who would actually do the controls while he was doing all of the other technical stuff of this. And so he came to me. I was a 3rd-year student. And he came to me and he said, because he knew of my interest in sound and technology and stuff. He said to me, Kevin, I have a job to do. And I said, oh, okay. And he said, it'll be going on for 3 weeks. I said, oh, that's okay. And he said, we start at 9 at night and we go until 2 in the morning, 3 nights a week. I said, that's okay. And he said that you'll like it. So he invited the two of us, me and a student who was a year more advanced, who had no interest in technology, but he liked the music there. And we spent 5 hours a night, 3 times a week, for 3, maybe even 4 weeks, programming the lights in real time. And the way to program the lights in real time was we took the controller surfaces and we went out into the square, not in the control room in the back. We ran extra long cables between the control surfaces and the recording equipment on the tape. So we would sit there and we would do 20 minutes or 25 minutes of this piece, and to get the levels and adjust the all that stuff. And we did this 15 hours a week in 12 channels. And I'd never sit in the same place twice. So I got to know this piece. I really know this piece well. It's like sitting in an orchestra. And my experience of this was that the sound was immersive is the wrong term, because the sense of being inside the sound was the sense that one has playing in an orchestra, where the sound comes from all around, except it was an idealized orchestra because there were 12 point sources there. But right. It did not sound idealized. It just sounded, given the technology of 1968, it was simply astounding that I was sitting there and I did not hear loudspeakers. All I heard was the piece, because the recording had been done really well. They used the Abbey Road studios.
Oh, wow. Oh, man, that's so cool.
There was money for this, and they recorded 16 channels. They got the London Philharmonic, or one of the major London orchestras, to do it. And Berio conducted. And the Swingle Singers, you can look them up, were the voices, and they were on their own individual channels. So the 5 Swingle Singers were put on 5 independent speakers out of the 8 in the middle. And therefore, when they had something, it was just continuous, like living inside this, like the Charles Ives band situation. Yeah. And in doing this, I realized I had no difficulty in listening to 7, 8, 9 things independently, simultaneously. So my hearing, I was ready for it as well. So my hearing kind of took a step forward. And when I went into the studio at McGill, I worked in 4 channels for 5 years. And it was in 1980 that the Concordia studio moved from being stereo. We built a second year studio, and we put in. I gave them my studio at home. I wasn't using it, so I gave it to the university, and they built it, and with some support, which was not easy to get because there weren't many people that had much interest in these weird sounds and these weird electronic people doing stuff like that. The audiovisual at Sir George Williams and Concordia were really helpful. Whenever I would go down and talk to them, they would love, looking back, I understand, they loved the ideas, the fact that I was prepared to move out of the simple box of stereo and away from the simple idea of putting up mics to record a band and mixing down to produce a stereo thing. Because my description of 5 channels is not based at all on the conceits of stereo. Stereo doesn't exist. Stereo only really works if you're dead between the speakers. At one point, we managed to find about a couple of $100 to buy 8 $200 speakers, which at that time was more than the annual budget for the studio. And we built this space in a small basement room with a sloping roof, but it was 8 channel, and there was an 8 channel half-inch recorder. And the students who went in there to do pieces, some of them were at sea. They couldn't handle this at all. But there were a few. I mentioned before about how the tide change of the hearing, who were ready for it, and they got in there and they realized that, in fact, this wasn't a version of a pop recording studio. This was a new model. This was an instrument. It wasn't a recording studio. When you are recording, when you go into a studio to record a song, they lay down the rhythm track, right? And they begin on beat 1. We had to begin on beat 1 because it was tape. So it limited certain kinds of conditions. But I encouraged them very strongly not to begin with the first sound of the piece when they were beginning to assemble the piece, but to start somewhere else in the piece. It's much easier digitally because I now have the classes only prepare sessions for the final work they do.
Right.
And the session is this piece we listened to the other day in the class. The composer came to the conclusion independently of me. I said, how did you begin the piece? He said, I opened up a session 5.5 minutes long. And I said, and how many tracks did you put into the session? He said, I put 100 tracks into the session. I said, like a canvas, right? It's a canvas, and you're going to paint in the canvas. I said, did you begin? I knew the answers to the question. I could hear it. It was clear. It was a stereo piece, but I'd listened to it and I knew what he had done. I didn't know he had 350 tracks. I thought he may have 150 or something. And I said, where did you begin the piece? He said, I began in the middle. He said he had prepared 700 stems. He had prepared 700 stems before he opened the session. So he had learned his materials and he had worked them into great detail. And he liked certain things. And he began putting into the session the sounds he wanted at certain places. Because he had so many tracks, he didn't have to be concerned about putting in 2 minutes of a drone because it wasn't going to occupy anything other than one of 100 tracks. And if he wanted more of it in the mix, he would just adjust the levels for that. And if he wanted to bring something else out in that, he would duck it. And he was doing the ducking automated and manually. But the automation of 100 tracks of that complexity is really, really, really difficult given current software. The current DAWs have no intelligence in them, because what's needed is you need an AI system that he would describe the relationship of these two sounds, and then the AI system would write in the automation on the tracks for what they were. And he built this piece out from the middle, and he added in various places in the piece like this. And what he had done, although he didn't know, he was trying to do a stereo version. I listened to the first 10 seconds and went, no, this isn't stereo. This is, you need to go to 7.1 immediately. But I didn't say that to him because of the nature of the relationship between instructors and courses. We're very careful. He wasn't in my class when he did the piece. He was in a class that most of the work was done in stereo because the instructor is a stereo guy and he works in the industry. And I said to him during the following discussion, I said, this is really good. I said, I have 2 complaints about it. And he kind of went, he was a little annoyed that I was complaining. I said, my first complaint is that it's too short. I said, you have composed a piece that's between 8 and 11 minutes long, but you felt you have to keep it under 5. And he gave me this smile that was like this wide, and his eyes opened up. And I said, that's one. And the other one is, you've composed this for a flat screen in front of me, but the sounds in your head are completely around everyone, everywhere, all the time. And he said, yeah. I said, we'll talk about how you're going to go back and fix this session. I said, you're going to bring this piece into the second semester of the course. And the first thing we're going to do is remove all the reverb, as much reverb as possible from it. He put the reverb on because people like to have nice sound. and therefore they add reverb to stuff to make it sound nice. But it's not about sounding nice, it's about being precise. It's about having the ideas expressed cleanly and clearly. If you want the reverb, you add the reverb. But it's not just put on because that's what's done. And I asked him a question which I knew the answer to. I said, did you cut into any of the reverb on any of the signals? And he kind of sheepishly looked at me and said, well, yes, I did. I said, good move. And no one had said to him that cutting into reverb was a good move. Clearly, he never heard that before. I said, because you've changed reverb from being a description of a space to being a spectral element of the sound. And the brain won't interpret that sound as being a sound with reverb on it. And therefore, you can use it as a new sound without having it associated with reflections from somewhere.
Right.
Kevin, I want to say thank you so much for everything you've told us. That's a gorgeous story, an amazing, absolutely amazing description of your history with multi-channel and how it applies to with your students. From there, I'm curious to know, is this how you see the future being? You see what I mean? I remember you saying the future is multi-channel, and now we have DAWs like Logic that have like a Dolby Atmos integration and everything. Do you see this as the future?
You have lots of questions there. In 1970, I started with Martin Gottfried. I started a group, a live electronic music improvisation ensemble called Meta Music. And Meta Music, the second year we existed, we bought 8 speakers, and the band only played in 8 channels. We put the speakers around the outside of the space, so everything was always specialized. Your question about Atmos is an interesting one, because Atmos is a tectonic shift. It's because it's no longer about creating the finished object. Atmos is about putting metadata onto the stems. And in doing this, if you can play this soundtrack or this file into a 2-channel or a 3-channel or 5-channel or 7-channel, or you can go to Belfast and you can play through their 64-channel 3-level system. And because the metadata is there correctly, it will play correctly in all of these systems without any interference, because it's no longer the master tape, so to speak, which is being worked towards. What's being worked towards is the session, and the session will define this flute as coming from the front left or the back right, or 15 degrees back from the front left. And if you have a movie theater with a 12.4.2.4 system, which gives you 12 speakers and 2 subwoofers and 4 speakers around at the top and 2 overhead, you can, as the composer of this, it's possible for you to decide that you want that flute to be overhead on your right. In places that have the 12.4.2.4 system, that'll be okay, because there'll be a speaker there. For those that only have 7 channels, they'll put it in channel 5. And for the stereo system, they'll put it on the right-hand side. What is happening is the change has been that the sound has not become the thing that's moved. What is moved is the intelligence of the object. And this is not part of the pop industry. And while the pop industry model of what recording is dominates, this idea of having metadata, artificial intelligence dominated systems will dominate what happens with loudspeakers in halls, but they're different functions. The people who are going to get into this first and are already there are the gamers. Because the gamers, do you have 4-channel headphones, by the way?
I don't, but I think
you know about them, right?
I know about them for
They
sure.
have 2 drivers front and back on each side. So 6-channel headphones would have front and back drivers and plus one above. And if you think about this for a moment, that means that the gamer can be warned about stuff which is up there because the sound is coming from above.
Yeah.
You must well love that. And
Absolutely.
the Mario Brothers with their...
Oh, that's my jam, though. That's my favorite type of game.
They're lots of fun, but they're not the same thing.
No, they're not.
They call it virtual reality. I think it's a little early to... virtual, I agree with. Reality, I think the discussion of reality is a little premature.
Right.
Pointing that, because what the gamers are going to do, if the recording people can get their asses out of blocking them from doing this, is they're going to come very quickly to the realization, as a number have, because I've discussed with them about, because they need to do things technically. They need to get the product out the door, so they need to do that. But some of the discussions are, but how do we do this for an enormously wide range of users, basically who don't share the same auditory experience? They don't have the same ears. And the answer to that is, well, you do it the same way that is going to be done for people wearing glasses. It used to be that when you wore glasses, the optometrist or ophthalmologist got you to read the numbers off the screen. And now they don't do that. They put this machine against your eye and it goes, and out comes the result, because it's measured the physiology of your eye. It doesn't need to have any indication what is going to happen, because it's simply, and that's in quotation marks, simply a metric of the physical nature of the eye. What is the metric of how people hear direction? That's not so simple. How do you hear sounds from above? You hear sounds from above because if you look at your ear, you have these ridges around there. The sound from above comes down, it hits the ridge, it bounces around the pinna of the ear and enters the ear canal. In the time it's bouncing around, it's become phase delayed from signals which are at the same level. And the brain detects that phase difference measured in microseconds. We're talking about the brain's ability, with its 1 billion neurons and 1 trillion synapses, to take sounds. This is how the brain works. That's how you know it's up there, is it gets bounced around the ear, and in the bouncing, it creates phase distortion and high frequency phase distortion. And the brain has learned that specific phase distortion means up there. But that is unique to each individual, because no two people have the same shaped pinna. And therefore, when I listen to binaural recordings, which is, the Kunstkopf, the head with the microphones in, I have to tilt my head 45 degrees forward, like this, so you can see the top of my forehead, in order to get the sound field to be level with the horizon. Otherwise, it's at 45-degree angle, because my hearing, my physical hearing, shifts sounds that come from Kunstkopf systems. Therefore, what is needed is a way of calibrating the headphones for the individual. And that will be done, because that's really straightforward to do. That's just putting the little thing against the eye and measuring how the eye responds to that. It'll be done they'll just play a click, or a number of bursts of clicks, and the individual will adjust the knob somewhere or somehow to make sure that the sounds are coming in at 90 degrees across rather than at a 45-degree angle. And just that. And the system will remember whose profile that is. So it's not going to be about having multiple speakers. I'm answering your question. It's about designing a way of creating the wave front going into the person's ear to create that effect. And you've heard of wave field synthesis. Wave field synthesis is holographic sound. Wave field synthesis doesn't reproduce the sound. It makes the waves, the sound waves within the space, to be the shape of what they would be if there were a ball that passed in front of your face. You can't hear it in the speaker because it's creating the waves. It's physically creating the waves in the space. Wave field synthesis. So it's not about the speakers. It's an entirely different way of creating sound. It's a hologram. And if you and Anthony were sitting facing each other at a distance of about 1 meter in such a system, if you had a sound that went from this side to the other side between the two of you, you would both point to it coming towards you, and you would both point it going between you and going away from you. It wouldn't be outside somewhere, because the wave, when the sound is directly between you, the sound waves that would reach your ear, because of the entire field being sound waves, those sound waves would be as if there were that object. But the sound waves are being produced by these tiny little loudspeakers. They're not speakers, they're piezoelectric drivers around the hall that's making the air vibrate as if it were there. So if someone walks behind you, the sound will pass behind you, because if you looked at the sound waves, the source is behind you, because the sounds are going to do that. So it's not how many speakers you're going to have. It's not multi-channel at all. It's holography. So the question is a good question. It's going to be the gamers who drive this, and there are hundreds of millions of them. And the gaming industry, as you know because you have been involved, is interested, and it will just kind of come in. And there's the VR systems, the virtual reality systems, that someone wrote an article I saw the other day about, so why hasn't Apple developed virtual reality goggles? There's a reason, and those who know Apple will know what the reason is. Amazon did, right? They did one. They did virtual, and they've withdrawn it, and there were one or two other companies. They put them out, they tried them, and they withdrew them. And Apple doesn't do that. Apple didn't release a free version of the M1 chip. They made sure the M1 was right, and once the M1 was right, that's what they did. They don't test stuff on the public.
Yeah.
And so the reason there's no publicly available VR equipment from Apple is because there won't be until they get it right. If you read the history of the Apple computer, the Macintosh computer, you'll see that was Steve Jobs, right? Who was the boss. When he was asking for the iPhone, he gave the dimensions it should be. And they came up with one that worked just fine, except it was 2 millimeters wider than his specification. And he went into the lab to try it, and he tried it. And he said, "It's nice." And they threw it away. They were really pissed off because they'd done all this development on it. He says, "Too wide." And he wasn't going to settle for 2 millimeters
Right.
difference. And they had to go back, and they had to shrink. And they had to redo the chips, because the chips were the shape of the chip and the blah, 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 all that stuff. And there's a book on him that's really interesting. And when the engineers came to him later, after all of this had become a raving success, they said they had, when I read an interview, one engineer said they learned more from redesigning for that 2 millimeters than they had learned in the development of the whole thing. And that redesigning to do that 2 millimeters less width meant that all the following generations were much better. He just insisted on that. And someone will come along with that strength and energy for the gaming, and they will bring AI into the gaming consoles, and there'll be Atmos type sounds which are recorded into the gaming consoles, not the ones that you currently have. That's my view. I could be completely wrong. I have no idea.
No, but it's an interesting view nonetheless. And we have a traditional question on this podcast that I want to ask you. And the answer here can be as simple as one word or monologue, whatever you deem fit. We ask this just because we like to see what each guest answers from all their different backgrounds. The question we ask is, what is your advice for people who want to get into the space of sound?
So I've been working with people for more than 40 years who have come to me and they want to do sound. And I can't talk about individuals, but I can't talk about a mass because it doesn't work that way. The individual who wants to do sound falls into one of 2 or 3 broad categories. There are those who want to do the sound. There are those who want to talk about what they do. And there are those who want to talk about it. And in universities, we have 3 departments that do those things. We have communication studies where they talk about it. We have electroacoustics where we do it, we don't talk about it. And we have the visual arts where they teach multimedia, where they do it and they talk about it. And each of these 3 suit different people's needs and interests. And the person who comes to me and says, I get a buzz from sound, I say to them, oh, what does that mean? And they say, well, I listen to this band and I like the drummer and I blah, 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 blah. And I go, oh, maybe you should, do any of the other, oh yeah, I do drawing and painting and you should apply for studio arts, the mixed media portion of the Faculty of Fine Arts. Or the guy who came to me and he said, I like this synthesizer because the sine tone is more. I said, you'll love this program. And I will talk about my former colleague, Daniel Feist, who taught in communication studies for many years. And they wanted to talk about music. They wanted to talk about things in the society and its relationships to society and what it means and stuff. So when people come to me, that's kind of the first triage I do in what it is. And then the people who want to do communication studies, I put them into that direction. Those with visual arts and sound art interests, I put them into the Faculty of Fine Arts. And then they come and they ask a question. I say, so do you write songs? They say, oh yeah, I really want to do this because I'm a songwriter and I want to produce my band and my song. I said, good. So take the music program and take the minor in electroacoustic studies. But your major will be music because what you want to do is you want to communicate with people through the songs you're writing and you want to talk about the meaning of what it is you're doing. And the person who was telling me about the sine tone on the 2 synthesizers, I don't talk about meaning with them at all. It's only about the sound. It's not about what the sound means. So I do the triage on that. Right now I'm working with 6 or 7 or 8 applicants for next year. I've been in contact with about a dozen, and 4 of them have dropped the application into the program because it doesn't do what they want. They think that sound will be nice to add to their songs. I said, fine, study songwriting, write your songs, get your band together, do the recording course, do a minor, do the recording course, do the first year electroacoustics to get some studio skills, and go out and do what you want to do. And the other ones, they have sent me stuff, and the first thing I give them is I tell them to do an unvoiced consonants study. They have to record 5 seconds of unvoiced consonants. They have to set up a session 30 seconds long and 20 channels deep and create 50 stems, 20, 30, 40, it doesn't matter how many stems, 20, 30, and have assign the channels being left, center, right, center, right. in groups of 5, and then place these sounds inside that canvas, and then listen to it, and then move them about until they find what works for them. Wow. And parents come to me and they say, what will my Jane, John, whoever do with this degree? And I say, this is a degree about electricity being converted into acoustical energy. My definition of electroacoustics. Wherever you find a loudspeaker, someone who has mastered the electroacoustic art will find energy, enjoyment, life, and will find a place, whether they're designing hearing aids, whether they're hanging loudspeakers in a hospital because the emergency room is, the articulation of it is not very clear, whether they're going up the CN Tower to replace repeaters in the system, whether they're rolling cables on a television floor. They are energized by sound, and they don't have to ask why they're energized by sound. All they have to know, they just know that they have this physicality, this thing that sound does for them, and they can work anywhere, and they can be happy doing it. Wow. And that change. And the electroacoustics program at Concordia provides a very wide base and a very deep foundation of fundamentals of hearing. And it develops the individual mind, which makes them really valuable wherever they go, because they're not just bringing forward what the most recent textbook on recording says. They are actually providing the person who's asking them the question with sound advice. I know, I get the joke of the pun in providing sound advice. But the sound advice, the nature of the sound advice that they will generate through the program and through their work in doing this, is that it's very personal. It's not the adoption of other people's views about what it's about. And it's a kind of, I can say this because I've spoken to a lot of people. I'm talking about looking at 50 applications or sometimes 100 applications over a period of 30 years. And the individual who is going to be sound may not be articulate. Some of the least articulate applications I've received, and some of the most poorly formed ones, have been people who have really, really, really benefited from this kind of broad-based exposure. And it's that way because their mind is not working verbally to explain what they're doing. They use verbal to explain what they're doing, but that's not what the idea is. The idea and connection is physical and spiritual in this way. And when they will meet musicians who are the same, they may be playing tabla and they're completely spiritual beings. They may be moving their fingers on the tabla. What's happening is this energy is flowing and they're tapping into this universal source of the flow of the energy.
That's amazing. I think that's a perfect place to put this conversation to a conclusion. Yeah, what do you think? I thank you so much. That was such a in-depth answer. Usually we get a paragraph or two. We got a whole essay. We got that was amazing.
Exactly. Kevin, if people want to get in contact with you, is there a place?
Kevin.Austin@videotron.ca.
Perfect. That will be linked in the description. Anthony, if people want to find you online, where can they find you?
I'm on most social medias, but I'm most active on Instagram, which is akachi.audio. That's ACACI.audio. Or on my website, that's akachi-audio.com.
Perfect. The artwork for this podcast is done by GoPro Keo. He's linked in the description as well. Please go give him a follow. You can follow Soundspace on social media, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, everything. And you can find us in your favorite podcatcher. Just type in Soundspace. Leave us a 5-star review. And I'm at Jaian Music on social media, and jaianmusic.com is my website. Thank you so much once again, Kevin. It's been a pleasure. It's been an honor.
Yeah, this is surreal.
This is surreal to me.
Yeah.
So we'll meet again next Sunday at 8:00.
Let's do a part 2,
Yep.
part 3,
Round 2.
Let's do a trilogy, Lord of the Rings kind of thing.
Yes.
Thank you so much. So for myself, Kevin and Anthony, this has been another episode of Soundspace. Bye, everyone.
Bye,
Cheers.
everyone.